The empire collapse pattern changed the course of history. But the story behind it isn't what you think. Stay tuned to learn more. In this video, we'll uncover the hidden patterns of the empire collapse pattern and why they matter today. We'll break down each stage and share key facts from historical data. And later, you'll discover the one factor that could repeat soon. You are living inside a story that started long before you were born. A story of empires that rose to impossible heights, believed they would rule forever, and then collapsed faster than anyone thought possible. Most people think those collapses were caused by war, bad leaders, or random shocks. But when you zoom out and look at the last 500 years, a disturbing pattern appears. The same sequence, the same mistakes, the same blind spots. 3 different superpowers, 3 different centuries, 3 different cultures, all following one invisible script, the empire collapse pattern. In 1590, Spain sat on top of the world. It controlled oceans, colonies, and more gold and silver than any empire in history. In 1914, Britain ruled the largest empire humanity had ever seen, with territories so widespread that people said the sun never set on it. In the late 20th century, the Soviet Union stood as the other global superpower, armed with nuclear weapons and a massive industrial machine. And yet, every single one of these giants fell. Their currencies shattered, their influence evaporated. Their citizens woke up one day in countries that no longer ruled the world. Here is the part that should make you uneasy. When historians map out those collapses, they find the same 7 stages playing out again and again. Economic overreach, military overextension, currency debasement, political decay, social fragmentation, legitimacy crisis, and finally, systemic breakdown. Now think about the headlines you have been reading for the last few years. Skyrocketing debt, endless foreign commitments, money printing at historic levels, polarized politics, widening inequality, failing institutions. It does not take a historian to see the pattern reappearing. In this video, we are going to walk through the empire collapse pattern step by step. We will look at what happened to Spain, to Britain, and to the Soviet Union, and then quietly compare those stages to what is happening right now. You are going to see how collapse really starts, why it accelerates, and why empires always think they are different until the very end. And stay with me until later in the video, because we will talk about the one factor that almost nobody is paying attention to. The factor that might determine whether this pattern repeats completely in our lifetime or is slowed down. Before we break down the pattern, let us make one thing clear. Empire collapse is not just an abstract historical idea. It is not about lines on a map changing colors. When a superpower collapses, it means currency destruction, shattered savings, broken promises, and entire generations who thought their future was secure, suddenly realizing it was built on sand. It means pensions that do not buy anything, careers that vanish overnight, and social contracts that quietly dissolve. If you live inside an empire in the late stages of this pattern, your life is not going to feel like a history documentary. It is going to feel confusing, chaotic, and unfair. Picture this: a middle-class family in late-stage empire. The parents did everything they were told to do. They worked hard, bought a home, put money into pensions, maybe saved a little on the side. For decades, that felt safe. Then, slowly at first and then all at once, prices start to rise faster than wages. The currency buys less each year. Promises about healthcare, retirement, and stability begin to sound thinner. At the same time, the news is filled with foreign crises, political scandals, and protests. That family is not thinking, "Ah, yes, the empire collapse pattern." They are thinking, "Why does everything suddenly feel unstable?" So, who are you listening to in this video? You are not hearing a sensational headline or a random opinion. This script is built on the work of economic historians, long-term financial data, and detailed case studies of how great powers expand, peak, and fall. The goal here is not to scare you for the sake of fear. The goal is to give you a clear map of the terrain you are standing on so you can recognize the signs before most people do. Because once you see the empire collapse pattern, you cannot unsee it. You start noticing the same moves, the same excuses, the same dangerous optimism that every collapsing power used to tell itself that everything was fine. Let us begin with stage 1, Economic overreach. Every empire starts with an engine of growth. Spain had New World silver. Britain had industrialization and global trade. The Soviet Union had rapid forced industrial growth and resource control. At the beginning, this engine creates wealth faster than anyone thought possible. The government can spend more, build more, promise more. Roads, ports, armies, social programs. All of it seems affordable when the revenue is flowing, like a river in flood season. Then something subtle happens. Instead of treating that river of wealth as a gift that will eventually slow, leaders begin to treat it as permanent. They lock in long-term obligations based on short-term booms. Spain did this when it built an entire imperial system around silver shipments from the Americas, assuming they would never end. Britain did this when it constructed social programs, military commitments, and a global administrative network under the assumption that trade surpluses and colonial profits would last forever. The Soviet Union did it by promising cradle-to-grave security, full employment, and enormous military spending based on a rigid planned economy that could not adapt. Economic overreach is not just about spending too much. It is about building a way of life that depends on everything going right forever. At first, nobody notices the problem. In Spain, as galleons full of bullion docked year after year, the illusion of infinite riches felt real. In Britain, as steamships, telegraphs, and factories multiplied, the idea of permanent dominance seemed almost obvious. In the Soviet Union, as tanks rolled through Eastern Europe and rockets punched into space, the story of inevitable victory felt unshakable. Only later, when growth slows, do the promises collide with reality. To really understand this, look at how these empires reacted to the first signs of slowdown. When Spanish silver production began to drop in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, the crown did not tighten its belt. It borrowed more. It raised taxes on already strained populations. It squeezed productivity instead of restructuring the system. Britain did something similar in the early 20th century. Facing rising competitors like Germany and the United States, it clung to its old financial model instead of radically investing in new industries. The Soviet Union, confronted with stagnant growth, tried to control more tightly rather than allowing innovation. If you look at modern data, you see echoes of this stage everywhere. Huge entitlement promises, vast bureaucracies, and a lifestyle funded by debt rather than true productivity. Tax revenues rise during booms and fall during downturns, but the obligations stay locked in. This is the hidden beginning of the empire collapse pattern. It never looks like collapse at first. It looks like prosperity bought on credit. Stage 2 is military overextension. Once an empire has tasted global power, it becomes very hard to pull back. Spain scattered its forces across Europe and the New World, fighting wars in the Netherlands, Italy, the Mediterranean, and beyond. The cost of garrisoning troops, building fleets, and subsidizing allies ballooned. Britain stationed soldiers and ships on every continent, trying to police sea lanes, deter rivals, and suppress uprisings. The Soviet Union poured resources into maintaining influence over satellite states, supporting client regimes, and matching Western military technology. From the inside, these commitments always feel necessary. Every base is strategic. Every intervention is essential. Every treaty is non-negotiable. Leaders tell their citizens that if they retreat even slightly, everything will fall apart. So, the map stays crowded with obligations, and the bills keep arriving. Over time, a simple equation emerges. The empire is spending more to maintain its position than it is earning from that position. Military overextension breeds a particular kind of blindness. Victories on the battlefield or successful deterrence make it easy to ignore the financial strain. Spain kept winning battles long after the economic logic had turned against it. Britain won World War I and World War II, but each victory left it weaker financially. The Soviet Union maintained a vast nuclear arsenal and a gigantic army even as grocery store shelves grew bare. From the outside, rivals can see the fatigue setting in. From the inside, every warning is dismissed as defeatism. This is a good moment to zoom in on one critical example: Britain after 1945. The country emerged from World War II technically victorious, but deeply indebted. Its cities were damaged. Its industries faced modern competition. Yet for years, Policymakers tried to act as though the imperial map could remain the same. They kept bases, garrisons, and obligations that no longer made sense economically. Each retreat from India, from Suez, from various colonies, was treated as a one-off exception rather than a systemic change. By the time the political class admitted the empire was over, the economic damage had already been done. At this point in the pattern, allies begin to hedge. They quietly explore relationships with rising powers. They question whether the empire can still protect them. Adversaries run small tests, a minor border provocation here, a trade dispute there, a cyber attack, or a proxy conflict. When the empire responds slowly or inconsistently, the tests escalate. This is how overextension sets the stage for the next phase. Stage 3 is currency debasement. Economic overreach and military overextension eventually collide with math. The empire's income is not enough to cover its promises. Taxes are already high or politically limited. Cutting spending is unpopular and risks unrest. So, leaders reach for the most tempting tool ever invented, the ability to create money. Spain's version of this was literal silver inflation. So much New World bullion flooded into Europe that prices soared, wages lagged, and the real value of Spain's income eroded. The empire had money, but not productive capacity. Britain's version was debt-financed war and post-war reconstruction, followed by devaluations of the pound and the slow loss of reserve currency status. The Soviet Union's version was a closed system where the state simply printed more rubles and issued more credit inside an economy that was not producing enough real goods to match. On paper, currency debasement looks like a miracle solution. You can fund wars, social programs, and interest payments without raising taxes. You can smooth over crises, bail out failing institutions, and postpone hard choices. For a while, it works. Then people notice that the numbers in their bank accounts are losing purchasing power faster than their salaries can keep up. Savers quietly move into hard assets. Foreign creditors demand higher interest rates or start looking at other currencies. Confidence, once lost, is almost impossible to rebuild. To see how dangerous this is, look at the psychology of money during late-stage empires. In the early days, citizens are proud to hold their national currency. It feels safe, even patriotic. As inflation bites, that pride turns into unease. People begin to think in foreign currencies. They measure prices in gold, in dollars, in anything that feels more stable than their own money. Businesses shorten contract terms. Landlords demand frequent rent adjustments. The currency is still officially in use, but unofficially, nobody really trusts it. In every empire that followed this pattern, currency debasement turned a slow squeeze into a rush for the exits. Spanish merchants began using foreign coins. British investors shifted into dollars. Soviet citizens turned to black markets, foreign currency under the mattress, and barter. When the money itself is no longer trusted, the social contract that holds an empire together begins to fray. Stage 4 is political decay. Up to this point, many people inside the empire still believe the problems are technical. They think a new tax policy, a fresh leader, or a single reform package will turn things around. But underneath, the institutions that made the empire strong are already corroding. Laws are applied inconsistently. Corruption quietly spreads. Short-term political survival becomes more important than long-term stewardship. Spain saw powerful nobles and factions fighting for influence while the central state stumbled from crisis to crisis. Britain faced waves of political instability as it tried to manage decolonization, economic stagnation, and social change. The Soviet Union experienced a rigid, aging leadership desperately trying to preserve a system that fewer and fewer citizens believed in. In every case, the quality of decision-making declined at the exact moment when clear, courageous decisions were most needed. Political decay has a psychological effect on citizens. They stop believing that the system can fix itself. Some withdraw into apathy. Others cling to extreme ideologies, convinced that only a total reset will solve anything. Trust in institutions, courts, parliaments, central banks, media erodes. Conspiracy theories flourish because official narratives no longer feel credible. When this happens in an empire, it is not just a mood, it is the weakening of the very structures that coordinate complex societies. Stage 5 is social fragmentation. Economic stress, political decay, and falling living standards do not hit everyone equally. Some regions stay richer longer. Some groups feel protected while others feel abandoned. Old cultural, ethnic, or class divisions that were once manageable widen into deep cracks. Instead of arguing about how to solve shared problems, citizens begin to argue about who is to blame, who is a real patriot, and who deserves to suffer. Spain's empire split between Old World elites and New World colonists, between court factions and regional powers. Britain's social fabric strained under the pressure of class divides, industrial decline, and waves of migration linked to its former colonies. The Soviet Union fractured along ethnic and national lines, with republics that had been held together by force suddenly asserting their own identities. In each case, the empire was no longer a unified we. It became a crowded room full of groups that increasingly saw each other as threats. At this point in the pattern, everyday life starts feeling different. Protests become more common, political rhetoric grows harsher, cultural battles feel existential, crime may rise, or at least the perception of insecurity grows. People retreat into like-minded communities, both physical and digital. The idea of a common future fades. An empire at this stage is still standing on paper, but its internal cohesion is already gone. Stage 6 is legitimacy crisis. Empires do not run on force alone. They run on belief that the government has the right to rule, that institutions are at least somewhat fair, that the currency is worth accepting, that the future will reward patience. When too many people stop believing these things at the same time, legitimacy collapses. Once that happens, everything else can unravel with shocking speed. Spain's legitimacy crisis came as repeated bankruptcies, military defeats, and economic misery destroyed faith in the monarchy. Britain's came as its imperial mission lost moral justification, its economy stagnated, and its global status shrank. The Soviet Union's legitimacy crisis was perhaps the most dramatic. A superpower that had projected an image of unstoppable progress simply lost the confidence of its own citizens. When the Berlin Wall fell, the physical structure crumbled quickly, but the psychological structure had been cracking for years. Legitimacy crises are often triggered by specific events, a financial crash, a lost war, a scandal, or a failed reform. But those events are best understood as catalysts acting on a system that was already unstable. When people no longer believe in the story of their empire, the smallest spark can ignite an inferno. Stage 7 is systemic breakdown. This does not always mean chaos in the streets or total collapse of order, although that can happen. Sometimes it looks like a rapid, negotiated transition to a smaller role in the world. Sometimes it looks like state failure in certain regions while others hold together. What it always means is that the empire, as a global superpower with reserve currency status and unmatched influence, ceases to exist. Spain became a secondary European power, overshadowed by newer rivals. Britain transformed from imperial master to medium-sized nation, integrated into alliances and institutions it once dominated. The Soviet Union disappeared as a state altogether, breaking into multiple independent countries. In every case, people who grew up being told they lived in the center of the world woke up one day in a different kind of nation. Now, here is the uncomfortable part. When researchers overlay these 7 stages on modern data, they see that the United States has already walked through most of them. Economic overreach, decades of promises, deficits, and debt, military overextension, bases and commitments in dozens of countries, currency debasement, massive expansions of the money supply and rising inflation, political decay, hyperpartisanship, short-term thinking, and gridlocked institutions, social fragmentation, cultural tribes that do not even share a common information space, legitimacy crisis, poll after poll showing collapsing trust in government, media, and major institutions. That does not mean systemic breakdown is guaranteed. Patterns in history are warnings, not prophecies. There are forks in the road, choices that can slow or redirect the process. But it does mean that pretending everything is fine is the most dangerous option of all. Empires fall fastest when they refuse to admit they are vulnerable. So, What is the hidden factor that could repeat soon, the one we mentioned at the beginning of this video? It is not a specific war or a single election. It is something more basic, the loss of fiscal discipline at the exact moment when external pressure is rising. Spain reached this point when its silver shipments began to decline, just as its military commitments peaked. Britain hit it when the costs of world wars and imperial maintenance collided with the rise of cheaper competitors. The Soviet Union hit it when falling oil prices and rising technological gaps made its planned economy unsustainable. Today, the same pressure is building in a different form. Aging populations, entitlement obligations, and interest payments on debt are all rising at the same time. At the same time, new technologies, new alliances, and new rival powers are changing the global game board. The risk is that leaders will respond to these pressures not with structural reforms, but with even more borrowing and money creation. That combination, external pressure plus internal fiscal abandonment, is the accelerant that has turned late-stage stress into full collapse in the past. Before we finish, let us zoom in a bit closer on each empire so you can see how concrete this pattern really is. Start with Spain. After Columbus opened the way to the Americas, Spain seized enormous territories rich in precious metals. For a while, it looked like a cheat code for history. Ships poured into Seville loaded with bullion. The crown financed palaces, cathedrals, wars, and a growing administrative machine. But underneath the glitter, the domestic economy hollowed out. Why build complex industries or invest in productivity when you can simply import wealth from mines thousands of miles away? As other European states learned to produce more with less, Spain relied on extraction and force. When the flow of silver slowed and military defeats mounted, there was no diversified economic base to fall back on. What looked like infinite wealth had quietly undermined the empire's foundations. Now, look at Britain. In the 19th century, it was the workshop of the world. British factories, banks, and ships dominated global trade. London set financial standards. The British Navy controlled the seas. But with that dominance came commitments. Policing trade routes, governing colonies, intervening in conflicts. As Germany and the United States rose, the British lead shrank. 2 world wars in the first half of the 20th century drained blood and treasure on an unimaginable scale. After 1945, Britain faced a brutal reality. It could not both rebuild at home and maintain an empire abroad. For a while, it tried to pretend it could do both. It borrowed heavily, devalued its currency, and promised social programs that assumed stronger growth than the economy could deliver. Eventually, retreat from empire was not a choice, but a necessity. Then there is the Soviet Union. Its rise was explosive. In a few decades, it transformed from a largely agrarian empire into an industrial and military superpower. Central planners allocated resources. The state promised full employment, housing, and education. On the surface, the system looked unshakable, but behind the statistics, inefficiencies piled up. Factories met quotas by producing low-quality goods. Innovation lagged behind the West. Massive military spending and support for satellites consumed resources that might have gone into modernization. When oil prices dropped in the 1980s and technological gaps widened, the economic model buckled. The currency lost credibility. Shortages became routine. The political system, already rigid and brittle, could not handle the pressure. Once legitimacy cracked, the collapse came in a rush. Notice how different these empires look on the surface. A Catholic monarchy, a constitutional democracy, and a communist one-party state. Yet the inner pattern overreach, overextension, debasement, decay, fragmentation, crisis, breakdown is the same. That is what makes the empire collapse pattern so unsettling. It seems to operate regardless of ideology. It cares about math, incentives, and human behavior, not slogans. There is also a micro version of this pattern that plays out inside households and markets during late-stage empires. When cheap credit is available and asset prices rise, families are encouraged to borrow for homes, education, and consumption. Businesses expand based on today's demand, assuming it will continue. Governments quietly encourage this behavior because it makes economic growth look stronger. For years, this feels like progress. Then the underlying reality catches up. Debt loads become heavy. Interest payments eat into income. A small shock. A recession, a rate hike, a supply disruption reveals how fragile the system has become. In those moments, the choices individual people make matter a lot. Some double down, taking on even more risk in the hope of regaining what they lost. Others cut expenses, simplify their lives, and build buffers. The same pattern appears at the national level. Empires under pressure can respond by acknowledging limits, restructuring obligations, and investing in genuine productivity. Or they can respond by doubling down on illusions, using propaganda and money creation to stretch the story a little further. History shows that most choose the second path until they are forced into the first. So, is the empire collapse pattern unbreakable? Not necessarily. There are examples of states that came close to the edge and pulled back. They are rarer, and they tend to involve painful choices. That is part of why we do not hear about them, as often they are not as dramatic as full collapse. Countries that confronted unsustainable pension systems, bloated militaries, or broken currencies early sometimes managed to stabilize and reinvent themselves. The key ingredients were usually honest diagnosis, broad social buy-in, and leaders willing to accept short-term pain for long-term survival. For a modern superpower, breaking the pattern would mean more than tweaking interest rates or passing a single reform bill. It would mean accepting that global dominance is not a permanent right. That debt cannot grow faster than real productive capacity forever, and that trust once destroyed is very hard to rebuild. It would mean facing the incentives that push politicians towards short-term fixes and asking whether the structure itself needs to change. It would mean telling citizens the truth, that some promises made in the past cannot all be kept in the same way in the future. Those are hard conversations. That is why most late-stage empires avoid them until crisis makes them unavoidable. The uncomfortable truth is that the math of the empire collapse pattern punishes delay. The earlier a society confronts reality, the more degrees of freedom it has. The later it waits, the narrower the path becomes. By the time currency confidence is evaporating and legitimacy is crumbling, options shrink to a few unpleasant ones. If you are still watching at this point, you are already doing something most people never do, looking at your own time through a long-term lens. So, what can you personally take away from the empire collapse pattern? First, understand that empires rarely announce their decline. There will be no official press release that says, the superpower era is over. Instead, you will see more of what you are already seeing. Creeping inflation, sudden crises, ever more dramatic political fights, and a feeling that the past rules of the game no longer apply. Second, recognize that collapse is not evenly distributed. In every historical case, some people and regions adapted better than others. Those who understood the pattern early diversified their assets, adjusted their expectations, and focused on building resilience rather than chasing the last bubbles of imperial excess. Those who clung to the old story the longest were often the ones most blindsided when it finally broke. Third, remember that history is not just a sequence of tragedies. The end of one empire has often opened space for new experiments, new freedoms, and new ways of organizing society. The collapse of the Spanish Empire did not end European civilization. The end of the British Empire did not end democracy or capitalism. The fall of the Soviet Union did not end Russian culture. What it did end was the illusion that a particular imperial structure would last forever. From your perspective as a viewer, this can all feel overwhelming. Giant historical forces, multi-trillion-dollar budgets, alliances and rivalries stretching across continents. It might seem like there is nothing you can do except watch events unfold. But understanding the empire collapse pattern is already a form of power because it changes how you interpret the news, how you plan your finances, and how you think about the future. When you hear about another round of emergency spending, you will not just think, free money. You will think about stages of overreach and debasement. When you see political leaders attacking each other instead of solving structural problems, you will recognize the signs of decay, not just another noisy scandal. When friends argue online about culture wars while ignoring underlying economic and institutional fragility, you will understand that fragmentation is not random, it is part of a larger arc. This perspective does not mean withdrawing in despair, quite the opposite. It means becoming more intentional. In late-stage empires, people who thrive are usually those who stop assuming that the future will look like the recent past and start planning for volatility. They build skills that travel across borders and industries. They avoid being overexposed to any single institution, currency, or narrative. They invest in relationships and communities that can provide mutual support when big systems wobble. It also means asking better questions. Instead of asking, how do we get back to the way things were? A more realistic question might be, how do we navigate the transition that is already underway? Instead of waiting for a perfect leader to appear and fix everything, a better question might be, what local and personal moves can reduce my vulnerability and increase my options? History suggests that waiting for top-down salvation during an empire's late stages is a poor strategy. In future videos, we are going to break this down into practical topics: how currency debasement shows up in everyday prices, what reserve currency status really means, why some assets survive imperial transitions better than others, and what warning signs have preceded past legitimacy crises. Think of this episode as the overview, the bird's-eye view of the empire collapse pattern. From here, we will zoom in on the pieces that matter most to your life. For now, the most important thing you can do is stay curious and stay aware. Do not be hypnotized by short-term headlines that treat every event as isolated. Start seeing them as part of a longer story. Empires rise, empires peak, empires decline. Individuals and families who understand that rhythm are not immune to the shocks, but they are less surprised, less fragile, and more prepared to adapt. If you are still here, you are already ahead of most people, because you have given your attention to a topic that most would rather ignore. That attention is your edge. Use it, share it, talk about it. The more people understand the empire collapse pattern, the harder it becomes for leaders to pretend that the current trajectory is sustainable. And remember, the goal of this channel is not to sell you fear. It is to give you clarity.